Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Good morning. How's everybody doing? This is Dr. Oba Tashaka, and coming to you again with the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Today is part 3 of a series, the first of God, the Superlative Light. And that one dealt with the fact that God is a force, an infinite force, that a part of which is in everything that God creates. And the second show was entitled The Primordial Twa, God's First People. Today's show is going to focus on the Twa role in shaping African culture. And it's going to focus on the way in which the Twa imparted civilization to ancient Africans. And I'm going to use a specific region of Africa as a study. And pretty much this explains how the Twa civilized Africans all over Africa and people all over the world. And this is extremely important because this is a missing part of history. So today, the title for today's show is the Twa Transmission of Civilization through African Ancestral Power. The Twa Transmission of Civilization through African Ancestral Power. So we're going to be looking at how the Twa transmitted civilization by the people who came under their civilizational influence, viewed them as their ancestors, and also drew on the first ancestral powers. And this is an approach that you haven't heard before with history, because we'll talk about the ancestors, but that's kind of like theoretical. We're going to see how this actually played out. And in fact, the way in which they transmitted civilization and culture to the people of one part of Africa, we're going to cover the Niger-Congo region, is the way they transmitted it throughout Africa. So the first thing I wanted to do is play a little Twa music. And the purpose of this is to put them in their proper setting, because as the first to introduce civilization to the world, they did it as spirit people and artists, much the way George Washington Carver was both a scientist and a musician and a singer. And so African spirit science is artistic and beautiful. And so we see in African civilization, music is a part of every part of African life. And you will note that it's a part of every part of African American life and African American culture. And in fact, it is the cream of the culture. It is the icing on our new African cultural cake. And so the Twa, um, their music really conveys much about their spirit and their civilization. So let's hear a little bit of um, Biaka Twa music. And thank Brother Lawrence Freelo for putting this on. Wasn't that beautiful? That's the music of the Aka Chwa. And this is a group that we're going to be talking about today. And I wanted to play that music because the Twa are the mothers and fathers of civilization. Um, and music is, and the art form of a culture is generally the highest expression of that civilization. And this is the first music of the world. And you can hear from this music, this is the music of the birds. This is the music of the water. This is the music of the breeze, of nature, nature music. And it's healing. And as I've quoted many times before, because I think it's a great quote, as Fool's Crow, the great holy man of Lakota, say, God's a sucker for music. All people are that have any kind of ear. Um, I see Lady Mosley, and I see Brother Ugawa, Lao Tzu, uh, Cosmic Upload, Lady Soul, and others. And Lady Mosley and her man just got to see a great blues performer, Catfish, who got him a Grammy, a young brother coming straight out of Mississippi. If you want to understand the roots of New African culture, if you want to understand the roots of the art form that African Americans have created, that is the global art form and the global culture of the world, then you go back first to the foundation of it, and it's the Twa. And then you go to the Yoruba, Sante, Dogon, Bambara, Kemet, all of these others that are the offsprings of it. And so I would call this spirit music, healing. You hear me? Healing for the heart, healing for the soul. And what's interesting is that the Twa give birth to civilization. The Twa give birth to the world's first culture, the culture of the world, both for Africa and for the world. And what's interesting, because I'm going to do a few comparisons here, the African in America has created a global culture and a global art form, and it rests on an African foundation. And the foundation that it draws from in America, the United States, is the spiritual blues. And then from the spiritual blues comes the blues, comes jazz, comes gospel blues, comes rhythm and blues, comes funk, soul, hip hop. You understand? All flowing from one source. And that's just the art form, but it's coming out of the culture. It's the tip of the culture. It's the icing on our cultural cake. It's the thing that brings beauty, the whole culture, in a society that has too much ugliness. And so we're dealing today with the Twa transmission of civilization through African ancestral power. And it's their beauty, the beauty of the people, God's first people, that gives birth to the beauty of African cultures and the beauty of African people. And I would say that the most important legacy, there are many legacies that Twa leave us and that African people leave us. And in the midnight of hell in this country and for Africans around the world, I would say the heart and soul of this legacy for human beings, the heart and soul in one word is kindness. And they are the preeminent manifestations of kindness on this planet. And some of our people, we're lucky to get kindness every now and then. Some of us, the little bit of kindness we get in our lives sustains us for the rest of our lives. And then some of us have been privileged to receive a whole lot. And so these are the people of kindness, much more. But this is the heart and soul of civilization, not skyscrapers, definitely not your weaponry or your techniques. It's the quality of your characters. And these are the people who possess the highest characters on the planet to this day. And so, wouldn't they produce a music? Wouldn't they produce a dance? Because they generally would dance to their music just as we do. That is, they're singing and they're drumming. So, wouldn't the people who have that kind of beauty reflect it in their art? So, these are the artistic mothers and fathers of humanity. So, I'm starting this particular show with the music, and I want to do a lot more with this with other shows, but particularly with this show, because today's show is going to examine how the Twa brought civilization to Africans who had entered the agricultural stage of development, the larger Africans who over time mutated from small to large. They're one people, the same, it's just that the Twa are smaller and they're the first and they're the heaviest. And the reason you see me putting so much time into them, they've been written out of history, and our own historians don't put enough attention to them. A few do. Clyde Ahmed Winters, Brother Brunson, a little bit Runoko Rashidi, and I give them, credit for their work. But for the most part, the Twa are neglected. But they're at the foundation of everything. And so, for a lot of reasons, I start from there. I'm not just limited to that, but I think that this is very important that you start with the root. How can you understand the fruit if you don't know the root? We're all a fruit of Africa. But what's a root? You got to go down to the deep root, In a previous show, I quoted an Ife Twa elder who summarized the Twa philosophy and really explained the motive behind the Twa imparting civilization to African people and to the world. What was their motive? What was behind this? And it's a beautiful statement. And this has application to us today when we're facing a choice between two cultures, and too many of us are, particularly young people, but some older people too, are caught in the trap of worshiping materialism. And some of us, not most, but some of us are placing dead presidents before human lives, and dead presidents before our humanity, and then wonder why we end up miserable. You know what I mean? So this is the Ife elder. I quoted him once before, but I thought this was appropriate for this show, and particularly for understanding the Twa motive for sharing civilization with African people and with the rest of humanity. And this is what this Twa elder said. He said, if you give a piece of your heart to things you own, you cannot love people with all your heart. Get that? You know what I mean? If your heart's in things, then it's going to be very hard to impart love to people. He goes on and he says, we love and take care of people, not things. And then he's talking about the larger Africans. The Africans and the white men can think what they please, meaning some may frown on this idea. Our ancestors of the first ages were rich and powerful. Here he's talking about the ancestors who founded Kemet. They say, and in previous shows, if you go to the Anu series, I talk about the Twa story. It's common among the Twa that their people created a civilization called Kimi, Kimi. And they sailed ships on the oceans. They built great monuments, and they lived in great cities. This is what he's referring to. But this is not the first age of the Twa. It was hunter-gatherer. But he says, Our ancestors of the first ages were rich and powerful. They lived in great villages. They used wonderful tools. They worked miracles. Those things did not make them happy. Happiness is a smile on the face of your wife. Now, this is for a hunter. This is what would produce happiness for a hunter's wife. Happiness is the smile on the face of your wife when you bring home the antelope. I think sisters now would want something else. It might be the meat if you're not a vegetarian, or the food, or something else. You know what I mean? But it's not just the thing, it's what it produces. It's the smile that you put on your wife's face, or your husband's for that matter. Happiness is the laughter of your children. Happiness is the music and the flute. You just heard that. Because these were people who lived, some say as far back as 300,000 years ago, 140, a long time in the hunter-gatherer stage, and they spent most of their time in leisure, playing music, enjoying themselves. Work was secondary because hunting and gathering took very little time. That's why they stayed in that stage for so long. Happiness is the laughter of your children. Happiness is the music and the flute. Happiness, listen to this, is freedom. Oh, this is real important. Happiness is freedom. Misery is oppression. Misery is slavery. Misery is colonization, neo-colonization, economic control by other people. Misery is any kind of thing where people are put under someone else's control. I'm adding to this, but this is his point. Happiness is freedom. And the Twa were the freest people on the planet. None of them practicing slavery. These are not the things you own. They are the things you enjoy. In other words, happiness doesn't come from possessions. Happiness comes from the things that you do in life that bring pleasure and joy to others, and puts a smile on their face. Me, in my relationship with my wife, I'm careful about not buying flowers when you got a problem. Just buy them anytime. You know what I mean? Just feel like it. For one reason, put a smile on her face. Because it's a surprise, and ladies like to feel that you're thinking about them all the time, not just in a crisis. You know what I mean? So happiness also comes from the smile on a child's face when they're hugged and kissed. And the Twa did a lot of hugging and kissing, and the men played almost the same role as women, carrying the children, nurturing the children. The women more so, but the men did a whole lot. You know what I mean? They were caring and kind. Their happiness came when a man came back from the hunt, and the first thing he would do is go to his mother and fondle her and hug her. And you know, some of these so-called experts on the Twa have the nerve to say the Twa don't even remember who their family is. These are people possessed with paranormal powers. You know what I mean? Memory, you don't know what memory is. You know, this right brain stuff right now, people use what? A small percentage of the brain and none of hardly the mind, which is the spirit mind. The Twa use most of it. That's why they could innovate civilization. That's the tie, by the way, to God, the superlative light, because they come directly from there. And then because of their honesty and integrity, they remain tuned to that to this day, even though they faced all kinds of hell. Some of the stuff I'm going to present today ain't pretty. And some of you might not even want to hear it, but the truth is what you're going to have to hear. Happiness comes when you're dancing. This Wednesday, my good friend Ronnie Stewart, who's in charge of the West Coast Blues Society, had a bunch of writers over at one of our best barbecue places. I'm going to say it. For me, it's the best barbecue place in the U.S. because I've eaten barbecue everywhere, but everybody has their views on this. It's called Everson Jones, and it's in Jack London Square, prime property, real big, a lot of people in there. And so they put on a blues show. And by the way, Ronnie Stewart has featured Kingfish at a number of his shows going back for a number of years. And so I stayed for 2.5 hours. And the last performer was the best. I've never heard her before. It was a sister. And she sang one of Aretha Franklin's songs. You know what I mean? And blew the roof off the place. Had that high-pitched sound, and it was a blues, baby, rhythm and blues. And Aretha come out of the church, you hear me? And didn't change her sound at all to make money. Aretha was always Aretha, you hear me? And a sister who was supportive of the Black freedom movement. And so imagine Black folks in our situation dealing with hell, and we're creating music. We're creating an art form that is perhaps the most beautiful art form on the planet. Imagine that, out of ugliness. Because we carried within us the souls of African people, and at its root, the spirit of the Twa. And by the way, the music is beautiful because it's spirit music. You hear me? The blues. See, I'm a blues man, and I'm a spiritual blues man. That's the foundation. And I like down-home blues. I like anything that's real gut bucket, you know, Muddy Waters, you know, the seventh child born on the 7th hour of the 7th day, when the 7 doctors say, born with good luck, can't you see? I got $700, don't you mess with me. Huh? Oh, Muddy Waters. He didn't come up with that song. That was written for him. And it's a mainstay in the blues thing. And of course, in the blues, the Hoochie Coochie Band, that's the one that's supposed to put a smile on a woman's face. I know you're going to get critical of this because you're going to be saying, oh, that's all he's doing is talking about sex. No, but what's wrong with sex? God made all these things that could perpetuate life lovely and beautiful. You hear me? Lovely and beautiful. And I always say to people who will sooner or later leave this planet, remember, there's some things that the spirits don't do. Eat good food, make love. And I'm talking about on the physical and the spiritual plane. The Twa enjoyed that. You hear me? So in my case, I'm 82, and August the 4th, I'll be 83. And I found in my case, the greatest joy in my life has come through movement work that put a smile on people's face. Movement work that gave people jobs who wouldn't have had one before. Movement work that put roofs over people's head. In ancient Kemet, they had a saying where they would say that I gave a boat to the boatless and food to the hungry and never harmed a widow. You hear me? And so that's been my joy. And when I walk in a supermarket and see these black and brown and yellow people, especially behind the cash register making good money, I know the movement that I led was a part of that produced that. That makes me feel good because they don't know where it came from. But the point is, if you can, have a good meal at the end of the day, a roof over your head, and then have people that you can exchange your love with, in addition to yourself and God, then that's real happiness. May not be full freedom, but that's real happiness. And then, of course, the smiles you put on, in my case, my students' faces. Oftentimes, it's not smiles when you're having a class, particularly examination time. But later, when I see them and I hear this, oh, Dr. Tashaka, that makes me feel good. But then they taught me stuff. You know what I mean? Like my book, The Integration Trap, the brother who's helping me with the show now, Lawrence Freelo, he was a major inspiration for that book. And he was one of my students and is now helping us with the technology, along with Brother Ogawa and others, Lao Tzu and others. So in life, It's what you do for others that really matters. In life, it's what you do to uplift others that matter. In life, it's not about what you're going to get out of it. It's what you can do for other people. And guess what? When you do good for others and don't expect any reward, that's when the greatest rewards are come. You know what I mean? And I can definitely testify to that myself. I had never expected to teach at a university. I wasn't introspective enough to even know that that was a calling. But when two sisters said, Ray Richardson and S.N.C.C. One, my spiritual mother, Ray Richardson, and S.N.C.C. my buddy, they both passed on in the ancestral realm. Ray Richardson at, I think, 99 years of age. And when they were running the department behind the scenes, while an African from South Africa named Njasani was running it, but they were really running it. You know how that works? Fortunately, they liked me. And they asked me, you want to teach at San Francisco State? And I'm at the Malcolm X Unity House. And, you know, we have Sunday meetings there. And it's 5800 Victorian building that I bought and organization owned. And so, you know, we would have various kinds of things there on Sunday, teaching people, feeding them, showing movies and whatnot. And so one day, Njasani comes and says, you want to teach at San Francisco State? And I said, yeah, well, I had never thought of doing that before. You know what I mean? But the point is, that was a reward for work done, both in the movement. These were ladies that respected it, and homework. And then it was Ray Richardson that passed the chairmanship on to me, which I definitely didn't want. Give me that call saying, Black study's been good to you, Queen Mother. You know, when Queen Mother tells you, you got to do it. And I said to myself, oh, shit, I did not want to chair no Black study. It turned out to be a good experience, but it wasn't one that I was looking for. So the point is, if we enter something expecting to get something out of it, then that ain't the best attitude, because you may end up being disappointed. In the Black liberation movement, don't expect brownie points. Don't expect people to be up here saying, oh, he did this great, he did that great, and it shouldn't matter. You know what I mean? But it's the thing you can do to help other people, and in the process, that's how you grow. For me, the greatest gift from being involved in this movement is growing and learning from people that a lot of people would least expect you to be able to learn from. Well, guess what? Everyday Black folks created this culture. Guess what? The wisdom of our culture is in our people, everyday Black folks. And yeah, we got some that, you know, well-known intellectuals or leaders or whatever, but it's everyday Black folks that have generally shaped this. As the people in Jamaica say, the culture comes from the dirt, from everyday people. If you look at a lot of these leading hip hoppers, where they come from. You look at a lot of these blues musicians, where they come from. Material poverty, spiritual and cultural richness in many cases, not all. So this, I think, is important. And for me, being involved in the movement, money has never been the thing. I don't take money for anything I'm doing in a movement. And I think that our people, King, Malcolm, all of them, Asante Shakur, and many, many others, Ella Baker, they weren't in it for money. Kwame Ture. But I'm naming the names. I'm talking about the foot soldiers, men and women, you know. They weren't in it for the money. They were in it for serving the people, for putting a smile on their face. So that's a part of the Twa legacy that is in you. And it's a part of your African legacy. But the purest part is the Twa part. And so for me, I know that my parents taught that people before money. My great aunt, that's what she taught her daughters, Marjorie Ford, a very beautiful sister who looked just like my grandmother, who's one of the most treasured people in my life, you know, beautiful Mississippi, proud Black woman, Black as midnight, and proud of every inch of it. Strutted. She didn't walk, she strutted. And when the men saw her, their eyes popped out. But my grandmother was a person of love and was a person who always desired freedom. That was her thing. And she gave me a lot of support because of that commitment that she had all her life. So in my life, you'll never hear me say I love anything material. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but in 1990, after I'd gone through this crisis of 15 months of looking at myself, I got myself together. My wife and I, my first wife, went to Africa, and we came back. And I told my wife, hide that key, because I had got a 300ZX sports car. It was black. And we were taking care of my sister's niece. And I did not want her to get that sports car because she didn't know how to drive and it'd be a mess. And so she hid it. Well, she's a Scorpio. My first wife was. And my sister's daughter is a Scorpio. These are people who are good at uncovering secrets. So she found the keys, got in the car, and drove it. But she couldn't drive it very well. It was a stick shift. And there was a funny way you had to work that shift to make, the shifting to make it work. And so to disguise what she did, she ended up scratching the car and leaving it 2 or 3 blocks away. If you know anything about black paint, if you scratch it, you have to take all the paint off and repaint it. You know what I mean? So when I came back, she's giving a story about it was stolen. That's what she was trying to make it look like. You know what I mean? And so I finally busted her down and got her to agree, to tell me, she took it. And then years later, she said, I was surprised. You weren't angry at me messing up your car. Well, I didn't like it. I'm definitely not going to tell you that. But I don't love material things and people before money and people before things. And in this particular case, my niece, before a car, even though I didn't like what she did. You know what I mean? So, but in this world, poverty's misery. We're under oppression. And so you need some material to survive. And so, what the C.O.R.E is saying, because they lived in a hunter-gatherer society where very little material was needed, then that's sufficient for them. And so it's a question of what's sufficient to maintain you at your level of happiness, but not at the level where you're weighted down by material objects and material things. And that's all you think about is money. And most blacks who are caught up in this value system ain't got any anyway. And the ones who are lining the jails, which is not, in a lot of ways, not their fault, in that a drug culture has been put in the community, a whole bunch of, there's no jobs, a whole bunch, but you have a choice in this. But, for the love of a few dead presidents, you know what I mean? But I understand you got to earn a living, but there's other ways to earn a living that won't hurt other people. So the central motive of the C.O.R.E in imparting civilization to the world, imparting culture to the world, was to put a smile on humanity's face. First African people, and then humanity, because they migrated into Asia, they migrated into Europe. They're the first people in the Americas. And so this was their main motive. And when we were talking, I think it was a week ago, about the emotia, which are spirits that materialize into human form, their whole purpose is to train certain young people in healing arts so they can help other people. And they ask for no pay for this. So this was the motive force of God's first people. I mean, all these churches that have been created and everything else, and Sunday, the main thing is the collection plate. God ain't got no collection plate. God's really looking at, what are we doing? We reached a contract in heaven. How much of that contract are we fulfilling? God just looking, because we got free will to make up our own minds about things. And God's not up there saying, reward me. We're into praise worship, and that comes from Africa, and that's a good thing. God doesn't need praise, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt because God is seeing that you haven't forgotten the force, the light that's inside of you. So the pattern of teaching civilization that the Twa brought to Africa, which in the West is called pedagogy, is the methodology that was used to carry on this culture and carry on this civilization. So historians generally recognize that there's a monogenetic basis for the origin of humanity, meaning humanity has one origin, and it's agreed that origin is in Africa. And we also have ancestors that precede humans who are also African, going back millions of years. But the human Homo sapiens sapien ancestors are all traced back to the Twa, Biaka Twa, and the Kung and the Kalahari Desert. And it can go back as far as 300,000, according to mitochondrial DNA, 144,000 years, give or take 10,000 years. It goes back a long way. So we have a common origin for humanity. We also have a common origin for culture, African culture, and African civilization. And African cultures share common cultural unities. There are some differences, mainly if you're dealing with Islam, for example. But even in the case of Islam, in West Africa, um, Islam had to conform to African culture. And so a Bambara who's a Muslim is a traditionalist, particularly those who are the teachers who are passing the culture on. And they learn the tradition in the same way that the Dogon do, through a Dunaso, table of signs. And so even when you have Islam, Islam has to conform to African culture, especially in West Africa. And one of the real indicators of that is the high regard that African women are held in African Islamic cultures, many of them, including the civilization of ancient Mali, where women were held in higher regard than men. That certainly isn't the case in Arab Islam or much of the rest of the Islamic world. So there's a cultural unity of African cultures, a commonality that also enabled us when we came to the US or the Western Hemisphere to be able to communicate with each other. First of all, many of our people spoke many languages. And in case of the Twa, they're multilingual. But for African people, they are multilingual. I was pointing out before, Dr. Abinga speaks 10 languages. His mother spoke 4 or 5. This is common in Africa. But even when you weren't speaking the same language, there was enough commonality in the way the language was structured. You could understand each other. But more important, your values were basically the same. And you may have had different names for God, and using languages that sometimes were spoken differently depending on the linguistic group you came out of, but there were common cultural unities, and these all trace back to the Twa. But here's the point, and the reason I'm putting so much stress on this: the Twa have been left out of history. And so when we're looking at ancient African history, if there's any discussion of this, if you read a history book, it's prehistory, and they'll talk about artifacts and stuff, but there's no real connection being made between the civilization of the world's first people and the civilizations that follow. But doesn't it stand to reason that if humanity has been in one state, a hunter-gatherer state, for as long as maybe 300,000 years ago, or 144,000, or somewhere in between, that most of that time was a hunter-gatherer stage, then wouldn't it be true that human beings who come out of these people would manifest cultural qualities civilizational qualities that had been practiced for the longest period of human history. Wouldn't this be in their cultural structure, deep structure, wouldn't it? And generally, you'll find this unity, but no explanation of where this unity comes from. And so, what are some of the common cultural unities? I've been really stressing this thing on God because the conception of God as infinite force outside of space and outside of time, the totality of force that's distributed, a part of which is distributed to everything that God creates, animate and inanimate, four-legged, two-legged, whatever, spirits that can't be seen. This is a common understanding of African people. And it is the common understanding that Africans carried into the Americas and into the United States. Spirit is at the top of all African cultures, spirit. And that's the force of God. And it's in you. You hear me? It's in you. So this is a cultural unity. Twa and African culture all follow this. And I pointed out before, Kemetic civilization is basically a spirit-based civilization. There's a commonality in African culture around associating wisdom with the light. And that wisdom is seen not as something that just comes from information you receive, but it is bringing out the light that is within each human being. And that light ultimately is God, and it is the aspects of God that are in us, the Ka, the Ba, we talked about this before, your destiny, your soul, all these different lights. We are lights, all human beings are. And so this is a common feature of African culture, that when they view wisdom, they're viewing it as a light that dwells within each of us. And so their educational systems are about cultivating the light, far from the Western educational system. So this is really the source of ancestral wisdom as well, as we'll see. First ancestors all over Africa are viewed as the ultimate primary source of wisdom. First ancestors, because they're the ones closest to God. So in all cultures, all African cultures, when you, for example, are being initiated into educational systems, and most often these are oral systems, whereas in the West, you're going to be tested and be given a written exam. Here, whatever skills you're learning, ultimately, when you're talking about what the source of those skills are, you will always refer to a master. My master taught me this. You'll see me doing this because this is the thing in African American culture. This apprenticeship system was carried to the US. John Henry Clark was a product of it. 12th grade education trained by masters. And so one of the people you hear me cite is my master, John Henry Clark said. You know what I mean? Or my master, bad little Jacob Carruthers said. And a master of humility, and a tough master too. Put that voice on you with me when we be talking. He said, well, you asked for it, didn't you? That meant a critique. You know what I mean? Huh? But again, ancestral wisdom. These are people connected to elders who were wise. But in African culture, the Bambara, for example, they call it chain of transmission. And so knowledge, whatever you're being trained in, if a blacksmith, whatever your skill is, a priest, whatever, a priestess, you will be trained by masters. But then who do the masters cite? Ultimately, they go back to the first master. And the first master is the one who had contact with God. That's their source. And so then if we're looking at this for African humanity, who's the first ancestor? It's the Twa. You hear me? They're the source. And we're going to see as we get into how the Twa transmitted civilization to African people. I could go into Asian stuff. If you read The Integration Trap, I cover that. But today I'm focusing on Africa. This is the source. Now, for us, like you get a PhD, your source is the books you quote. I want to stress my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is considered a classic because it comes from the source of God. You hear me? And I'm not saying that for any other reason than it's true. I'd like to be able to say, I was so smart, I came up with this on my own. I really don't care how I came up with it as long as I got it. But to get it from God, what a treasure, what a pleasure. And so people will say, oh, your thesis. A thesis is a theory. A theory is a guess. It's operating on this linear logic. The vision of the just society that the mother principle reveals comes from the light. And so it's a whole truth. It's no theory. And it's based on the practice of the Twa. You hear me? And when God gave me the Twa, it didn't just give me the vision of just society, it gave me the Twa. And it kept telling me, look to the Twa. There's more to this than you think. And so since this vision in 1990, I've just been opening my eyes more and more to what they have to offer. And it is profound. And they are the first ancestors because they come with the light, the purest light, and still to this day possess it. All African civilizations make this distinction between divine knowledge and sacred knowledge. The Bombardu, divine knowledge comes from God. The vessels who receive it from God, first ancestors, and then those who receive it from them, to really to transmit it properly, they have to be pure vessels, free of fault, free of blemish. That's approximating God, the superlative light. And if you do something wrong, even for good, you have to give that office up because you're a pure vessel. That's not the average person. The Twa represented pure vessels as a people. But in African societies, to transmit this, what you often had to do is through initiation, get people on the higher plane that reflected that because everybody wasn't reflecting it. And we're going to get into the relationship of the Twa and the Niger Congo Bantu people, and we'll see how that manifested as they're introducing civilization to them. So this is real key in African education, that it is a transmission belt coming from the light of the first ancestors transmitted on down through the line of novices and apprentices. So divine knowledge comes from God. Sacred knowledge is the knowledge that human beings gain and try to see through their life, through their speech, through their walk and their talk, that it's pure. And that's where the power of this knowledge comes from, its source, a pure source. Now, African cultures, all of them place a primary value, and African American, African Caribbean, Africans, wherever they are, because our cultures come out of this, place a primary value on speech, on the word. And the primary value, even though we gave birth to writing in Kemet and other places, and some of us need to affirm this because we are ashamed of the fact that many of our cultures were oral and not written, and you shouldn't be, because in these cultures, people's memories were their books, they were their libraries, and they didn't forget anything, you know? And furthermore, their knowledge was based on truth. And so in African societies, there is a general value for speech as the primary value for communication. And when you write, writing should conform to the standards of speech. On the one hand, is Jacob Carruthers would say, with Medu Nefer, which is the sacred speech that humans speak that come from God. It should be in the writing and in the speaking, a walking, talking, doing language, like a holiness preacher. You hear me? That would inspire a John Coltrane to play that bad music. You hear me? While they're, you know, imitating through their gestures and everything else, their message. That's coming directly from African culture. Or in our music, a trumpet player, a saxophone player, a drummer, a bass player, a piano player. They're imitating the sound of the voice, the human voice. And the blues musicians are some of the best at this, especially the blues guitar, the best guitarists. You would think it was a human being up there, except one that has a force and a power like few speakers. You know what I mean? And so this was key, both in the African transmission of knowledge, starting with the Twa, who teach through the truthful word, and through African cultures in general, including those that are literate. And so in Black writing, you have what is called orality in the literature. I write the way I speak. Some Black writers do. Zora Neale Hurston wrote the way she spoke. In European culture, that is frowned upon. And so some Blacks who have picked this up will also frown on it. John Henry Clark wrote the way he spoke. That's, again, the orality in the literature, because what you're trying to do is to put in it the force that comes from speech. And that force is particularly strong when it's true. So the power of speech derives from, again, God is infinite force, a part of which he distributes to everything that God creates, is the beautiful light. And so God's power is manifested through vibrations, through forces. And so the power of speech is in its vibratory force. You're not going to get this in any books, because what's happened is we've theorized this to death. And so even when we're talking about spiritual, we'll call it spirituality and theorize it. No, it's the spirit. There's no word for spirituality in any African language. And so the power of speech is in its vibratory force, and the power in vibratory force is the truth. Speech that is truthful is powerful. You know it when you hear it. You hear me? Because you can feel the vibrations. The younger generation will say, I feel you. They can feel it. And if you are really attuned to vibrations, you know when those vibrations are off. You know? And the thing about vibratory speech that is grounded in truth, it's healing. It's healing. It's not only healing for the speaker and for those that hear it, but it's healing for plants. Or the vibratory force that comes from a Marvin Gaye. I play Marvin Gaye because I'm up here where you got deer and stuff, and I'll see the bluebird up there. The bluebird peaks up. Not just Marvin Gaye, almost anything coming from our music. Or you whistle, you know. It ain't the whistle of the bird. They know you ain't got the language, but they'll perk up and, you know, take those heads that are always moving because they're worrying about that hawk or something bigger they can get to them. You know what I mean? And they perk up because it's a vibratory force that's coming to them. And that was in the songs of the Twa, the vibratory force of the birds, of all the animals in the rainforest. You hear me? So this is a cultural unity of African people. And we carried this into the Western Hemisphere. We carried this into the United States. So when it comes to the transmission of African culture to African people by the Twa, what I want to do is look at the Niger-Congo region and the Bantu people in particular, who were the people who the Twa civilized in this area. Now, the Niger River is the largest river in Africa, 2,600 miles long. It's the longest, going northeast to the Gulf of Guinea. And it includes the areas of Sierra Leone, Guinea, and other border areas in the West African area. The Niger-Congo speaks to a linguistic group made up of Mandi, Kwa, Bantu, Congo, and Gur, G-U-R people. So these are a variety of different people who speak this language group, Niger-Congo. The Bantu people are Central and Southern African people, Central Africa, the Congo especially. And their language group is spoken among the Bantu, the Congolese, the Luba, the Kikuyu of Kenya, Swahili, and other speech groups. So this is a fairly large grouping of Africans from whom many of us are descended. And so in looking at the role that the Twa play in civilizing the Niger-Congo Bantu people, you're going back 7,000 BC in the beginning, or even earlier, and then at a certain period, 2,000 to 3,000 BC, when this interaction takes place, but it can even be earlier. And so this is an interaction between the Twa, who innovate agriculture, and who larger Africans, as Africans begin to grow in size and stuff, they pick up this agriculture from the Twa, and these are Bantu people. And by the way, Bantu includes Zulu people, which is my namesake, Shaka, coming from the Zulu. So it's the oral tradition of the Bantu people. And by the way, we usually neglect oral tradition. We're always looking just for the writing. And so then that really wipes out African history. And especially when you have Africans who are trained in history. The Jellies in West Africa, they're trained at the feet of masters, and they're the masters of eloquence. The book, I don't know if any of you have read it, Sundiata, an epic of ancient Mali, written, it was recorded by the statements of Niani. Niani recorded this, but it was a Jelly historian, in this case, the historian of the royal court, who was giving the history of Sundiata, better known as Sundiata, the great warrior king of Mali. Now, there are two statements on African and African-American history that I found to be the most eloquent. Malcolm X on Afro-American history, and Sundiata, an epic of ancient Mali. These are two just absolutely beautiful, magnificent statements, but they're statements given by a Jelly, who is a Malian historian, who, as a historian, has had to know the lineages of most of the people of Mali, and particularly the royal clans. And so if you neglect this kind of history, then you're neglecting the history of Africa, much of which is oral and has been maintained. And you're just going to go for bone fragments. And you're going to go for what anthropologists and white historians and some Black historians trained by them say, with a little bit of literature, the Arab literature or whatever. And that's important, especially in Kemet, where you, particularly in dynastic Kemet, you've got a lot of writing you can draw from. But the point is, for most of Africa, you got to go to the oral tradition. And again, that's the cultural unity of Africa. And check it out. Jellies, when they're given an account of history, there are other Jellies sitting around them, historians. If they make a mistake, they are corrected. And you can't make too many mistakes. You're not a jelly anymore because jellies are initiated. And initiation requires that you adhere to the truth just the way a priest does. You hear me? And so when you get from, in this particular case, Bachwa people, their oral tradition saying, what was the role of the Twa in transmitting civilization? This is what they say. Quote, they say, the Bachwa, B-A-T-W-A or T-W-A, Twa, so-called pygmies, and don't use that term, I'm just using it to identify, make sure you know what I'm talking about. They say, the Bachwa or Twa are, quote, the indigenous teachers and guides who led us, the Bantu people, to the locations that were favorable to live in because they're migrating and they're coming into Twa territory. And they don't know the first thing about living there or living in a certain kind of state at all. And so they say indigenous teachers, the Twa were indigenous teachers and guides who led our people, the Bantu, to locations that were favorable to live and taught us how to survive in the previously unknown rainforest environment. And this is particularly true in the Congo, which is rainforest. Whereas the Kung is in the Kalahari Desert, the Congo rainforest. And a lot of agricultural Africans are afraid of the forest also for a lot of reasons. None of them got too much weight to carry on them, but afraid of it because of the spirits and so forth. So it's the Twa who introduced the Niger-Congo Bantu people, because these are Bantu people coming from these different regions, to civilizational skills. And get this straight. It is after the Niger-Congo Bantu people undergo transformation through the Twa that they move from a wild to a civilized state. So get that. Get that, because that's the meaning of civilization. So according to the Bantu, these are some of the things that they were taught that were basic. All moral teachings and teachings, also technical teachings in terms of how to survive and technology and stuff. But the first one was prohibition against incest. You don't sleep with anybody that is closely related to you, let alone your sisters or brothers or mothers or fathers. Out. You hear me? Huh. In the wild state, they had to be taught that. You hear me? They taught them, these are basic things, see? Because this is the early period where the Twa have invented agriculture, and you begin to see the development of larger people and some Twa themselves moving into agriculture while many staying in the hunter-gatherer stage. And so some of these larger Africans that come into being, they haven't been schooled in some of the arts of civilization. And so they didn't know how to make a fire. Twa taught them. They didn't know how to cook food. See, this is basic stuff here. You hear me? You want to talk about civilization? Huh? This is real civilized stuff here, right? Huh? Cook food. They didn't know how to domesticate plants because it was the Twa that gave birth to agriculture, and it was particularly Twa women that innovated agriculture. They didn't know how to weave clothes. They taught them how to weave clothes because some people think the Twa didn't have any clothes, huh? Yeah. They taught them how to make pottery. And by the way, when you go into ancient Kemet, which is incorrectly called pre-dynastic, I've renamed it. I'm not going to go into that now. But when you go into ancient Kemet, one of the finds you find in this 10,000 year early history of Kemet are all this pottery. And beautiful pottery with certain designs that were key to ancient Kemet, and then some shaped designs for dynastic Kemet. So pottery, so you can, hold your food stuff, right? And whatever. And then check this one out. Because this is technology, baby. They taught them how to mold iron. And one of the most important trades in Africa is the blacksmith. But we see a blacksmith as just an occupation. The blacksmith is a spirit occupation of the highest order. And when a blacksmith is smelting iron, the blacksmith, first of all, does rituals to the spirits of the earth. And a blacksmith is high up in the initiatory systems. When you're initiating people not only to the blacksmith order, to become masters in the art of making tools and stuff, but in other areas as well, the blacksmith is high up in this area of mastery. And then, of course, there are many other things that the Twa introduced the larger Africans to. The Twa gave birth to democracy. If you read my book, The Integration Trap, Generation Gap, caused by a choice between two cultures, I go into this in depth. They're the authors of democracy, not the Greeks. The Greeks had what they called democracy in a few city-states for a very short period of time, and democracy does not characterize the culture of most Aryans or Europeans. But the African, it's a part of our blood system. We have to have a say-so and stuff. That's why it's so hard to organize us. But if you get us together, you've really got something. You know what I mean? And that's why our art form is heavily democratic, jazz. And it's an aristocratic, democratic art form, full of counts and dukes and ladies, right? But you get those titles because of your character in many cases, not always, but in many cases, and your mastery of whatever it is you play or sing, you know? But once you get out on the floor, you improvise or you innovate. That's the democracy in it. That's at the core of our culture. Gotta have a say-so. We're the don't tell us what to do people. All African people are. I've told you this before. I joke with my wife and I tell her that my favorite blues song is Don't Tell Me What to Do. It isn't. It ain't got much to it. It's just I'm giving a point here that, you know, we don't like to be told what to do. Some wives like to tell their husbands what to do, but they don't want the husband to tell them what to do. Some husbands like to tell their wives what to do, but they don't want to be told what to do. And the correct thing is neither one of you should be telling each other what to do. You hear me? We're both here with some good common sense. Let's just talk about it. Reach a consensus. That's the African way. You know what I mean? So the Twa introduced to the Niger-Congo Bantu people civilization, on many different levels, because there's many other things that they introduced them to. And the key thing is Twa women as gatherers in the hunter-gatherer systems, the Twa women were the innovators of agriculture. And it took a long time to innovate agriculture. And I don't think that they were particularly looking for an agricultural society. They were living in a plentiful society, the most plentiful society human beings have ever lived in. And they were taking care of themselves quite well, but there was experimentation going on all this time with wild plants. And that's what the sisters did. And they were the stable source of the food supply in hunter-gatherer societies. And by the way, it's very important to stress that the source of the high treatment of African women, children, and elders is Twa societies. And then it permeates throughout African societies. But there is no mistreatment of women or children or the elders in Twa societies. And there's no real war either. You know what I mean? No real war. Hunter-gatherers are just moving from place to place to find places to hunt. They're not engaged in warfare, but they are able to defend themselves. They have their, protection against bigger Africans and later against the whites. But basically, they live basically in peace as a people, as a civilized civil people. So it's in the gathering activities that Twa women begin to experiment, and particularly experiment with cereal grains. And the cereal grain experimentation wasn't easy because basically you're choosing the right seeds from hundreds of wild grasses, hundreds, and maybe more than that. And then you grow them in bulk, and it's a difficult undertaking to produce anything that's edible out of this in the way of grains. So we owe to African women the invention of agriculture. And that is also praised in the literature of ancient Kemet. Aset is the mother of agriculture, but the Twa are the mothers of her. She is herself Anu. She's Twa. She's agrarian Twa, as the C.O.R.E was. So to this day, African economies are primarily agricultural. And it's African women that are providing the food for Africa and being exploited under the colonial, now neo-colonial system of the West, and imbalanced relationships that develop between African men and women, where the crops of men, where men grow crops, because in most parts of Africa, it's the women who do it exclusively, where the crops of men will garner more on the market as cash crops than crops of women. So there's the oppression of women. And if Africa is going to be free, the African woman has to be free more than anything. Free her, you free everything. You hear me? Free her, you're going to free everything. And all this micro lending that they have, to provide a little money to set up businesses. The best investment is always proved to be African women. Why? Because when they get money for a business, it's going to a business. And that money is going to go for something that will help their children, for schools, for education, for clothes, for food, And so it's the woman. Empower the woman, you'll empower the man. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you leave the man oppressed either. But it's the woman who transmits culture. And if you've got a conscious and smart, educated woman, then what you'll have is a conscious and educated people. So the Bantu and other African people throughout the world, particularly people in Asia, in America, in Europe, they owe the origin of agriculture to African women. They owe it to them. And yet, it's African people who are starving now, in many cases, living on $2 or $1 a day, and some not even seeing that much. And this is part of what has to be corrected. This is part of the point of this discussion, is how do you take what you can learn from your past and apply it to today to transform your own situation today and tomorrow. Now, a lot of people have trouble believing that the Twa created world civilization, that the Twa created African civilization. They have trouble believing it. And one reason is that today the Twa have been reduced to the lowest socioeconomic state of any African people on the African continent. And so people are associating their material condition with their civilizational skills. Now, the Twa already told you that they value people more than things. That in the hunter-gatherer society, they did not care that much about material things. There's a question here about, are the Twa pygmies? Yeah, I made that point before. The Twa do not like that term. That's a term that came from the Greeks. It means literally dwarf-sized people. They're not dwarf-sized. They're full-sized people. They're just small. They don't like the term. And it was also used by Europeans to define the so-called pygmies as uncivilized and backward. And you'll see that that term has been laid on them recently. They still get that laid on them for other reasons. I'll go into that later. This is real key about the Twa, that their socioeconomic status, which is poor, and there's a lot of things that when I get further on, I explain this, that have put them in this position in this world, has then led people to question, well, how could people like this give birth to civilization? It's the same stuff they do with us. They'll say, yeah, how can these black people give birth to come? Nah, that's a joke. You have the president of China laughing at that. You know what I mean? Laughing at that. Huh? It was Volney who stood before the pyramids and said, the people who we've colonized are the people that gave birth to civilization. What an amazing thing. You know what I mean? Huh? So the Twa get that rap just as we get that rap. And unfortunately, for a lot of blacks, because we've been miseducated and been put on this no civilizational diet that you don't have no history, no culture, some of us believe it. You know, we watch the movies and Cleopatra's, Elizabeth Taylor, and so forth. And so, you know, we think, well, you know, that couldn't be. Or I have blacks asking me, Hannibal was black? Yeah, he came from North Africa, Carthage, you know what I mean? Tunisia today. One of the greatest warriors in the world. What else could he be? They have a coin, a picture of Hannibal with his natural hair. And then the Europeans try and say, that ain't Hannibal. That's one of his soldiers. Who in the hell puts a coin together for a soldier? It's usually a great warrior or a statesman or whatever, you know? So the Twa, when we look at this, they are the origin of humanity, and their socioeconomic condition is due to oppression today. But that does not mean that they didn't originate civilization, just as it doesn't mean that we didn't as well. And I said this before, I'll deal with this later, but just as the Twa gave birth to civilization, you black folks here have given birth to a civilization with an art form, with an in-depth culture. It's one of the most beautiful in the world, and the world recognizes it. We need to. So this is the miseducation that we've been fed, to the point where we'll say they took our culture in slavery. I've gone through this before. They can't take your culture. Your culture is embedded in you. It's in your genetic memory, and people have gone to the other side, say your cellular memory. And this is one reason we could come out of slavery with our humanity intact. We came in with so much intact. They couldn't take all that out of you. You understand? And it's the enslaved African and the one right after slavery that, though rough and tough on the exterior, were the most African and the most kind and the most sharing. Because it's embedded in you. I mean, if you're going through 300,000 years of history and then 400 of oppression, which do you think is going to take, have a greater influence on you? It's that longer one, but it's the unconsciousness that we have, this historical amnesia that we have, and the lack of knowledge of what Africa is. And I'm not talking to most people who are watching this, because most of you know your history. But for the average black person, they don't know that a culture that's based on word up, that's African. They don't know that an art form that's called hip hop comes from a Wolof word, hippie cat, hip, sing from all sides. They don't know that. You know what I mean? Huh? So there's a lot of things that's about us, that's in us, that we don't know is African. But it don't mean it's not, and it certainly doesn't mean you lost it. So this is real key, when we're looking at the Twa. Today, Niger Congo Bantu people today hold the Twa in low regard. They will refer to them now as not highly civilized people. And today, many Twa live in dire poverty. And in the case of the Congo, many Twa have been eliminated through these resource wars that have been carried out in the Congo, where millions of people have died. In Rwanda, during the genocide of Hutu and Tutsi, A lot of Twa were murdered, and they had nothing to do with the arguments that the Hutu or the Tutsis had with each other. And of course, all of this had to do with the colonial mindset that led to this genocide. So the Twa are not living in the condition that they should live in, and they're not giving the respect that they should receive. And yet, in spite of that, even today, the Bantu people who gained their civilization from them fear and respect them for their mystical powers and for their special relationship to the spirits of the land. And that's because they are still living in spirit-based civilizations, even under colonialism and now neo-colonialism. Their cultures still have a strong spirit base. Now, the key point in the Twa transmission of African culture to Bantu people and other African people, because I'm using Niger-Congo Bantu as just a paradigm, an example for how it was transmitted to African people in general. And then you can speculate on how it was transmitted to other parts of the world. So the key point in this is in transmitting the culture, it was the power of the first ancestors that was key in this transmission. And it is key to their central role as civilizers for African people, in this case, Bantu people, Niger-Congo people. To understand this, you can't see civilization in the Western way of just a material phenomenon. And this is generally the way civilization is portrayed. The dictionary definition is people who have cities, people who have a certain level of technology, who have class systems and so forth. And this is the definition of civilization. It can certainly include that, but the quality of civilization is basically the quality of the way in which people treat themselves. And to be civilized is to be civil. I went through this before. But also the Twa, who did not live in cities until they built Kemet later in the ancient period, they had the elements of civilization, astrophysics, medicine, a system of governance that's the most just in the world, a family system that I'm going to briefly get into today that was the most balanced in the world, a relationship to nature where there was no exploitation of nature, So they had not only the qualities of civilization, but they created them. They were the innovators of them. Look at the people who start off with their idea of God being the same as quantum physics, because except that they know the source. It's God. It's not just some force to be manipulated for control. They're not thinking about control. So this is at the base of how the Twa are able to transmit civilization to the Niger-Congo Bantu people, because they have the same belief, because they're coming out of a Twa civilization that the ancestral source, and particularly the first ancestor, and then we'll see a particular type of first ancestor, is like the key to prosperity. In ancient Kemet, the pharaoh was the mediator between the spirit world, God, and was considered a god, and humanity. This was what his power rested on. But this was the power generally that Africans saw as a basis for success or prosperity. That is, your ability to be in harmony with the spirits. So when the Bantu people migrate into Twa lands, and this also happened all over Africa, where they're moving into this, and note the Niger-Congo Bantu region is huge itself. They believed that the only way they could prosper on the new lands that they entered was, one, through learning the art of civilization, some of which I just described that the Twa imparted to them. But the main thing that they needed to prosper, see, in a material civilization, is money. That's what is defined as the seed of progress, dead presidents. But in African cultures, the key to you growing crops, the key to you having children, the key to you to having a prosperous life is to be in harmony with the spirits, and particularly the first spirits of the land. And so when Niger Congo Bantu people move into Twa country, and in this case, in the forest regions of Central Africa, um, they know that the first spirits of the land, as they are all over Africa, are Twa spirits. And they also know that the ones who can communicate with them are the indigenous Twa who live on the land. And so if they're going to prosper, they've got to be educated by the Twa. First, they don't know how to cook meat, make clothes. They're in trouble. You hear me? So it's kind of like you're coming into a situation where people are going to mother you and father you. You hear me? And so you better come right in Africa. If you want wisdom imparted to you, you have to have the right attitude. And if you don't have the right attitude, the elders don't give you much of anything. And so they had to come humble. These big old Bantu people coming up with these little people. They knew that they were the intermediaries to the spirit world. They had the power, spirit power. And that's because it was their first ancestors who were in the land. And that meant that their right to the land, the Twa right to the land, was based on ancestral presence. Understand, there was no notion in Africa of land being owned by any person. But the right to live on that land was based on the ancestors under the land. And to this day, this is true of all spirit-based cultures. They don't want to be separated from their lands because they're being separated from their families. That is, their ancestral families. So what the Bantu people realize is that the Twa who are living on the land are the intercessors, mediators, and mediums with the spirit world. And the last show we went through, the Queen Mother in Ghana, who was a medium for Emosha, materialized spirits. They initiated her into the healing arts. And again, those were Twa spirits, 2 feet tall, that, initiated children at the age of 8 for 8 months in the forest. And so it's the ability of the Twa to maintain contact with these spirits and the civilizational skills that they have, both as just caring people, but as people who have knowledge of civilization that was required by the Bantu people. If they are going to survive in this situation, then they are going to have to be educated, civilized by the first people. Now, what's real important is in the beginning of the contact between the Twa and the Bantu people, when the Bantu people come in, they're coming in small groups. And in my book, The Integration Trap, what I do is show that when the Twa innovate agriculture, that then the first societies that were formed were small. And then in time, because in the beginning they were Twa, and then over time you have the evolution of larger Africans, these are small societies. These societies are consensus-based. That is, they're run by the group. And they had 2 terms for the family systems at this time, for the Bantu family systems. One was Cuckoo, C-U-K-U, and the other was Ganda, G-A-N-D-A, Cuckoo and Ganda. Generally, the anthropologists have translated Kuku to mean matrilineages, which means family systems where you inherit through the line of the woman. And it meant that women were powerful in these societies. And they were right about that. They were powerful in these societies. Ganda, the term Ganda, later came to mean lineage and clan, and later also could specify the place of the king, because when they came in, they didn't have no kingship. And so what hasn't been studied a lot by African historians, some have, Chancellor Williams did, study the small societies. Chancellor Williams studied classless age grade societies in Destruction of African Civilization, and showed how these age grade societies were societies where people in one age group had a certain responsibility, then they transferred as they got older to another, and so forth. And then at a period of time, they could assume a certain amount of decision making in that society. But it was a society without kings and queens. And so we often do not study these societies because we're into the big. And so a lot of Africans who were enslaved came from classless age grade societies, small democratic societies. A lot of the people from Nigeria, the Igbo, come from this group. And these Igbo committed suicide a lot because they could not stand the restrictions on their freedom. I pointed this out before. They were called flying Africans. And what that meant is they would go to the river and drown themselves and fly back to Africa. And I pointed this out before. The Igbo so democratic that when they share this cultural unity where you pick your destiny in heaven, the Igbo actually argue with God over their destiny. That's the Igbo. But you had a lot of these small societies, and a lot of Africans who were enslaved came out of them because they didn't have the military power to resist the big ones. And some of them were not as corrupt as the bigger ones, who some of them engaged in the slave trade. So when the people come into the area where the Twa live, the Bantu people are living in small societies, and these societies are centered around women. But to call them matrilineages is incorrect. If you read my book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, this book's considered a classic. I make the discovery that these terms, matriarchal, patriarchal, matrilineal, patrilineal, matrilineage, patrilineage, they don't have any meaning. Why? Because African systems are not unilineal. That is, one line, one way. And what I discovered was that in a system such as the one being described by the Bantu, that's considered to be matrilineage, actually, and that meant your descent came through your mother, you inherited through your mother. When you looked at what a matrilineage was and is in Africa to this day, it is that it is the eldest brother who's the leader of the family. So the wife or the mother, it's her eldest brother who is closest to the children, more so than the father, because this is a twin lineal system where inheritance is being traced both through male and female lines. And so in this particular case, it's the male brother, the female sister. And I think that that system may have been constructed that way, one, because the brother's on the female line, and the brother can be protective of the woman against the husband if there's problems. But the key thing is that in this twin lineal system, it's one that inclines towards the woman. And that's the kind of system that the Bantu people have when they first come in contact with the Twa. And this makes it easier for these two groups to interact because they're not coming in with these egos and with this power and everything else. They're small in size. They got women playing a big role in decision making. But again, twin lineal. So the Yoruba, the exception, where men are farmers. In most cases, women are. And in this particular case, the last name is traced through, in most Yoruba systems, because some of them have a matrifocal orientation. Uh, your name comes through the name of your father. You inherit through the line. Males inherit through the male, their father. Females inherit through the female, their mother. Males inherit the use of land, since the males are the farmers. Women inherit from their mothers those things necessary for carrying out the economy. The Yoruba man has to put his wife in business, and everything she makes is hers. For brothers who want to do polygamy, just remember, you got to support a bunch of women. And if you got them supporting you, that is not polygamy. You hear me? Oh, no. And that's the first thing a lot of brothers want to get into. Oh, they want another woman. Really? Can you handle it? And I'm just talking about financially. Can you really handle it? You know what I mean? But there's an argument for it. I'm not getting into that now. There is an argument for it, and I understand it. So the family system that the Bantu people have, they inherited from the C.O.R.E. That is a twin lineal system. And this is the system that is a basis for the mother principle that comes from God, this vision, and the family systems, and generally the systems, the hunter-gatherer systems, where societies where all the males and females were equally empowered to govern every phase of society. So that was the system that the C.O.R.E. already practiced. So they can deal better with people coming in with a cultural face similar to their own, since it came from them to begin with. So what anthropologists incorrectly call matrilineal descent, where the family head and the family's last name and inheritance is passed through the female line in the matrilineal thing, is a twin lineal system. And so in this system, then there's a balance that's very important, a balance between males and females, and a synthesis of masculine and feminine. And this is key to how African family systems work. So when the Bantu people come to the C.O.R.E. in the Niger-Congo region, in the beginning, they were living in these small twin lineal communities that are equal, and with women having a lot of power on the Bantu side. So there's respect that is being shown on both sides, particularly the Bantu, because they're in a weak position. And if they don't get the favor of the C.O.R.E., they're in trouble. So over a very long period of time, the Bantu people showed respect to the C.O.R.E. In the beginning, they intermarried with them. And sometimes the C.O.R.E. would come and live in the Bantu villages. Occasionally, Bantu women would come and live in the forest with the C.O.R.E. But the Bantu were students. The C.O.R.E. were teachers. And alliances would begin to be formed by the Bantu with both the C.O.R.E. and with other groups of people, but particularly with the C.O.R.E. And these alliances were designed to promote economic prosperity. So the intermarriage was one alliance. And it enabled them to also, as family members, in the case where the C.O.R.E. marry a Bantu person, then they're able to pass on this knowledge also through the family of the flora, the fauna, the geography, and the skills of civilization. And so this is over a long period of time that this interaction occurs. And during this particular period, the Bantu community itself begins to grow, not just based on C.O.R.E. interaction and involvement in their families, because the largest number of people in Bantu families are Bantu. And the Bantu are very careful about this, because if they get too many people not coming from their group, they won't be loyal to their lineage and their clan. And it's agricultural people that have lineages, which are larger groupings of families. Hunter-gatherers don't. And then clans, which is a much larger grouping of people with a common blood type, common ancestor. So blood ties. So these early communities grew. And what happens is that in the beginning, the Bantu are viewed as they are, as latecomers, and the Twa are viewed as firstcomers, that is, latecomers to the land. The Twa are the original inhabitants. Now, the Bantu people believed that the presence of the primordial Twa ancestral spirits entitled them to land use. This was the key thing. They respected that because they knew that spirits would not treat them right if they didn't. And so the very existence of Bantu communities depended on their correct relationship with the spirits of the land. So when they have good relationships with the Twa, who are the mediators with the spirits of the land, they are then being educated into initiatory systems, educated into rites and rituals that have to be performed to reach these ancestral spirits that are Twa. And so this is the main role that the Twa play, along with all the other things that they do to innovate, to introduce the Bantu to civilization. Now, over a period of time, the Bantu gained these powers, and this is over hundreds of years. They gained these powers. And over a period of time, the Bantu began to then put themselves in the position of being the first comers. And they have various ways of doing this to treat themselves as though they are the first on the land. And this change in relationships begins especially, see, this is the part that ain't too pretty. You need to understand it, because cultures have weaknesses. And African cultures, as beautiful as they are, they got their weaknesses. And they ain't all attributed to colonialism or slavery either. Because one of the conclusions that I reached when I was writing the book, Return to the African Mother Principle, Male and Female Equality, and going to Africa and talking to people, including my Babalawo, Ifeyemi, who's an Araba, second highest in the Yoruba priesthood, I talked to him about this period of male-female balance and masculine-feminine synthesis. And he said, yes, among the Yoruba, you had, in the ancient period, balance between males and females. And then, in the Yoruba case, men started to grab more power. Women then put magic on them. And then the men called to God for help. And so God said, the only way you're going to get this straight is go back to balance, which they did for a while. But then after a while, they didn't. You know what I mean? There are stories in the Niger-Congo Bantu region about the Kikuyu, where the Kikuyu say that there was a period where the children's last name came from the woman, the mother, and women held the most power. And the men decided to get all the women pregnant at the same time. And at that time, they would take power. Now, that's unlikely. But the point is, what they're telling you is there was a period where there was a move by males to shift power away from females to males. The women insisted that the children continue to have the last name of the mother. So this is a compromise, but power is shifting. There's a kingdom in Ghana called the Bono Kingdom, B-O-N-O, and this precedes Asante. And I spent time in Ghana, going to villages, looking at this stuff, and so the Bono period, it's an ancient period of Ghanaian history where women ruled. Now, in most of Africa, women did not rule exclusively, nor did men. But in this particular case, they did. And there comes a point where war comes to Asante land. And at that point, the women don't show up for the war council. They said they all had a menstrual period. This obviously was not the case. But the point is, they felt that they were not equipped themselves to lead a war party. So then the men and women meet and they set up what's called dual stools, because in Asante system, you have Asante Hina, who is a king, Asante Wa, who's a queen mother, and they sit on stools. And this stool system has to do with the origin of the Asante nation. But So at this point, you could say it's a sharing of male and female, but it's actually shifted more to males. And so part of what's going on during this period, I think, is that as power dynamics change among these larger Africans, then relationships between men and women change, and relationships between Bantu people and other African people and the Twa change. And so in this particular case, in the Bantu case, what happens is that one, the term for compound begins to be, or Ganda, that term comes to mean king's compound. And it also means larger village. And what also happens during this time is the accumulation of a lot of wealth. This is a real key point. And with the accumulation of surplus wealth, remember what the opening Twa said, we don't place a value primarily on material things, the primary values on people. And so what's happening is power shifts are occurring, because as these villages get larger, you have little kingdoms and stuff, little power games are starting. And so it's during this particular period that the Twa begin to see the Bantu people showing a face that is not hospitable. It is a power face. It is a face where they now are moving to displace the Twa as the central agents of civilization. And so now beginning to create mythology that they are the bringers of civilization, and then beginning to designate the Twa as being uncivilized. And whereas before marriages occurred between Twa and Bantu, now they're prohibited. And Twa began to deal at a distance with Bantu people, often providing meat and other things, bananas and other things, and in trade with the Bantu, but generally a place outside the village. You know what I mean? So this is the shift in power relationships. And this particularly comes through the stratification of these societies with power centers. And these struggles for power are really key for this. And what enables the Bantu to shift this power is that they have now gained ritual power. And so they have access to the ancestors of the land. And now, even though they recognize that the first ancestors are still Twa, they now feel empowered to go on their own and use Twa mainly for ritual purposes, while reducing them in terms of their status in society. And this is the nature of what happens when material things become more important than people. And that happened to an extent with Africans. Now, I'm not saying that the Bantu became totally oppressive. They hadn't taken on the mentality of Europeans. They had a communal system. They had some just things. But what happens then when slavery comes along and colonialism comes along, then that just weakens the whole thing. For Bantu, Twa find when they're dealing with Bantu, then they're dealing with people who are being pressured by the colonizers. So then the Bantu are pressuring them, and so this contributes to relationships that are not balanced, not equal, not respectful. So today, the Twa need to be viewed in their proper role as the creators of world civilization and the creators of formative African history. And we need to address the condition of their oppression the way Europeans address their issues. They place their issues on the top of the table when it comes to oppression, but the most oppressed people are people of color and African people on the planet, and generally they are not given any due. And so the issue of the Twa needs to be raised, and they need to be supported as a people. Their paradigm provides the paradigm for saving the planet from ecocide. Their paradigm provides the most basic and fundamental models for creating just political and social systems. The group-centered leadership model of Ella Baker comes from this balanced male-female system. The Twa paradigm provides at its foundation the basis for reconstructing societies. Because when you're talking about all the males and females being equally empowered to govern every phase of society, that is a model for governance that is superior to this idea of checks and balances, the executive, legislative, and judicial. They're supposed to be the checks, when in fact the role of government in the Western world, and this is a system that's been adopted by much of the world, is to protect private property, and it is to protect big private property. And that was the whole point in the second treatise on government by John Locke. That's their system. And it comes in with the introduction of the idea of the land, the air, and the water being private property, which is an idea foreign to all African cultures, starting with the Twa. And so this whole notion of communal sharing and everything else, God didn't give the land and the air and the water to any one people or any person. It's the source of life. And so when you can have the richest people on the planet gobbling up everything, then everybody else is put on a $2 a day or $1 a day or no dollar a day budget. And so this is the basis for correcting this. Now, the key point I want to make here is what I'm talking about here, this is a new school of history, because it's going to the very foundation of human and African history. It's hooking African history up with its roots. And generally, we're dealing at the high point of African civilization. So, for example, ancient Kemet. Almost all the work is on dynastic Kemet, first dynasty. Arguments over did it occur in 32, 3300 BC, so forth. And we're dealing with dynastic Kemet. That's important. We should deal with that. Greatest civilization in the history of the world. But all historians say this. When the first dynasty of Kemet occurs, all the elements of civilization are already in place. That is, the civilization of dynastic Kemet, as they call it, was shaped in what is incorrectly called pre-dynastic or ancient Kemet. Most historians agree, Sheikh Anta Diop and others, 10,000 BC, starting 10,000 BC. We've gone through this in talking about the Anu. And so these Anu people, the great ones, they're the founders of Kemet on all levels of civilization. The only thing they didn't build was pyramids, but they built the Sphinx. Huh? So, if the early Kemites gave birth to Kemetic civilization, they happen to be agrarian Twa called Anu, why don't you study them? I'm not saying stop studying dynastic Kemet, but I'm saying, why don't you deal with the root? That's where all the creativity came from. Huh? That's my focus. And so when you leave the Twa out of history, you leave the root out. You hear me? And so then history is left dangling without a foundation. So the Twa give birth to formative African and world history. If we're going to understand the history of the Yoruba, the Asante, the Kemites, the Igbo, the Dogon, the Bambara, the Congo, many others, you got to deal with the root as the foundation of that. And the way in which civilization was imparted, the creators of that civilization. Now, some people would say, I don't see why it matters. They're Black, you know? So what difference does it make whether Kemet was founded by Twa, or in this case, Anu, called Twa, you know, or originally Twa, What difference? They're black. Well, that's kind of like saying, let's just take this to another level. Let's say I'm an artist, I'm a musician, right? And I've come up with a composition. And someone else comes along and plays it and claims that it's theirs, but they're black. Does it matter what color they were? It was yours. And in the case of civilization, and I think this applies here, we create a civilization in this country. Every effort is made by others to rip it off, right? Like at the foundation of the blues, you got blues festivals all over the country that are white and got hardly nobody black performing. Now, people will say, oh, they're taking over the blues. No, they aren't. There's not a single innovator in the blues that's white. And innovation is where creation occurs. And so we're not going to lose the blues just because some whites are singing it and an average white person can't sing the blues. It's a language. It's kind of like mushmouth, where, who is white can sing the blues. And there's a philosophy behind the blues. It's not a sad or unilineal philosophy. I've gone through some of this before. So authorship's important, and we need to know the authorship. And so Kemetic history is going to have more meaning when we understand its foundation. African history is going to have more meaning when we understand its foundation. Global history is going to have more meaning when we understand its foundation. The Chinese, their civilization was founded by Anu people. First two dynasties, the emperors and empresses were black. The yin-yang philosophy comes out of this, male-female, which is coming out of hunter-gatherer, though the emperors and the empresses were not hunter-gatherers. They had moved to the agrarian state. So, in concluding, Twa history is a basis for the cultural unity of Africa and is the reason that there are a lot of cultural unity shared between the Twa and people of color throughout the world. And the fundamental basis for Twa civilization serves as some very important models for reorganizing societies today from just to unjust. One of the most important, of course, is spirit and the role of spirit in society, but the other is the balance of males and females. The fact that if you're going to have justice, then it's not just going to be a justice of males or justice of females. It's got to be an interaction of both. And societies have to be reorganized on this. The Iroquois Confederacy was organized on this. We're not the only ones that have this, but it comes from us. I don't know if they got this from us, but the point is they had this similar kind of balance. The clan of the women, the clan of the men, and it inclined more to the women, So the Twa, they are the transmitters of civilization through African ancestral power. We need to draw from our great African ancestors the truth and wisdom that we need for today. We need to make the past serve the present. Hotep. Okay, let's see what we got here. Brother Ugawa, this lecture is mystery school level. What books do you recommend to study the Twa? I recommend as a primary book, The Integration Trap Generation Gap Caused by Choice Between Two Cultures, because that's where I extend my study of the Twa from the mother principle to this and begin to answer some other questions, because the mother principle answered the basis for just societies in Africa, the family system that I call twin lineal. It primarily focused on that. So the integration trap goes into other dimensions of Twa culture and then hooks it up to the agrarian democracies as a separate chapter, and then it hooks it up to the Anu in Kemet. Then it hooks it up to the Asians in Asia who were Chwa in the beginning, and the first people in America, in the Americas, who are also Chwa. So that is kind of a comprehensive thing there. But the main focus of this book is on our culture. The longest chapter is on our culture. So that is the main one. There's a book called The Black Truth, and it's written by a brother named Asar Jubal, Jubal, The Black Truth. And there's a book called Pygmy Katabu by Jean Pere-Halle. This is full of racism in it, but it also has some interesting points. So sometimes you have to weed through the mud to get something good. Gladys Harris, is this the Western Bantu people? It's both, because you have people who are coming from the West, and you also have people who are migrating up from the South, coming from Zululand and other places. And the Zulus didn't experience slavery, they experienced colonialism. Let's see what else we have here. Here's Hermana Mengistab. Is it true that women had more than one husband in ancient Africa? Not to my knowledge, no. But I do know of situations where women, whether in Islam or in other situations, Mali, for example, ancient Mali, where a wife had male friends, which meant male lovers. They weren't husbands, but it was acknowledged by the husband. That's because though they were in Islam, it was a matrifocal twin lineal system that inclined towards the women. And so women must have had this power before they came under Islam. Gerard, the Twa are also the originals of Ireland and the story of the leprechaun and the story of St. Patrick. Yeah, that's true. Oh, Sister Gladys Harris. Thank God I mixed with Nigerian Twa today. Right on. Okay. Brother Ugawa, question. The idea of royalty titles being connected to musicians' character, could that be the reason why so many rappers call themselves young or little? Because psychologically, the title of royalty taken in jazz by artists and also in rhythm and blues and in blues, and probably a few hip hoppers as well, Queen Latifah and a few others, that reflects a royal character, culture, because the older Africans who were coming out right after slavery, that's the attitude they had. My wife has a term that comes out of the Caribbean called poor great. They're poor financially and great in character, great in the way they carry themselves, great in their perception of themselves. And this is contrary to popular opinion. Yeah, that is really the basis of that. It doesn't mean that everyone in jazz or blues have the royal character. Because of the interference of slavery and in Africa colonialism, characters can not always be as correct as they should be. So some of your jazz musicians, they ain't got the best characters, right? Or blues musicians, or hip hop, or gospel, but some do. John Coltrane is like a manifestation of some high character, even when he was on drugs and alcohol. For people's information, the Integration Trap book has not been changed. It's the same book. Neither has the Mother Principle. It's the same book. Okay, let's see if there's anything else. Brother Kamari said, I'm bringing home the antelope right now. Low, right on. That lady you have, man, I can see why. It's your responsibility anyway, though now brothers and sisters work, but I can see why. You're an intelligent man to do that, and a good man too. Oh, by the way, this outfit that I'm wearing, I wore this at the Million Man March. This was, I purchased this in the market in Ghana in the 80s, and then I had a tailor make it. And in Africa, men and women are both tailors. I think it was a man that made it. Okay, let's see what else we have down here. Worley Smith. When I listened to your presentation, I realized that many people lack a deep understanding of the idea of spirituality. Religion as practiced in the West tends to separate and confuse. Yeah, and basically, the stuff that's coming out of Africa, both in us and deriving from Africa, is spirit-based. And so if we're dealing with the spirit that resides inside of us, then we're really getting grounded into those higher truths. Hesat Menhir, when you say the Twa were the first people, do you mean they were the first Homo sapiens? Yes, I'm referring to Homo sapiens sapien, the people who we call humans today. I'm not referring to hominids who had, like Lucy, who had human characteristics but were more ape-like or something else. So, yeah, that's definitely it. And that's what mitochondrial DNA confirms. And that's what general history confirms. They're the first, and they're all over the world, but starting in Africa. Okay. Shai Arma. Once the Twa distance themselves from the Bantu, do they fully retreat to Central Africa? The Bantu distanced themselves from the Twa. Let's get that straight. And there were always Twa that never had anything to do with the taller Africans. So they were always Twa in the inner regions of Africa, whether it was the forest region in the Congo or wherever else, or in the Kalahari Desert, you know. But then there were others who interacted. And so what happens is when this division between the Bantu and the Twa occur, in many communities, they still maintain relationships. And so it's a relationship of economic exchange. And so the Twa produce what the Bantu people need, usually meat from hunting, fruit, and other things. And so there's a trade. And so then Bantu people, they usually have various kinds of iron weapons and stuff, which the Chwa innovated. So, which is itself interesting. So, those kind of relationships take place, but it's not the kind that occurred when civilization was established. Okay, this is Mata Minjo, Mata Min Mojo. Was best worshipped around Africa? No, but in Kemet, it was the netter of music and dance. Um, while some people regard Bes as Chwa, Bes was a dwarf, and Chwas are not dwarfs. But Bes was symbolic of the Chwa, and there's plenty of evidence for that in Kemetic Medu Neter script. And being associated with the Chwa is therefore associated with Asar, Aset, and the founders of what's called pre-dynastic Kemet. See if there's anything else. Okay, that appears to be it. Oh, there's one more. Let me see this. Okay, Brother Ugawa, how would you connect this series to your last series on Black Power and institution building? Well, one is this would clearly connect to the series on Black Power and education, where I dealt with making the lower mind the servant of the higher mind. This is directly speaking to that. And it's speaking to that because the people who are the founders of civilization are the people with the whole mind, closest thing to God. And so they didn't have to go through any system of disciplining the lower mind to obey the higher mind. They didn't. They had not been exposed to a Cartesian, despiritualized mindset, where everything is separate and reason is used for the purpose of gaining possession, power, and control. They were the very opposite of that. So they were at the root of this. So it connects in that way. And it ties into the whole idea, when we went into African-centered education, we were showing how it grew out of Black studies and how the center point of African-centered education is spirit. And that we rested the discipline shift on that. And I made the point that Dr. Wade Nobles was supportive of that. And that is the groundation or the foundation of African philosophy, let alone of African culture. Spirit is at its foundation. Most Black studies and Africana studies departments have not done this because, A, they don't believe it's legitimate. And some of them come out of holiness churches and spirit-based systems that are African-American, but African-based. And others just have a fear of the spirit. And others think that you're not going to get these white people to approve that. That was the most radical thing we did. We pushed the envelope of African-centered studies so that it would be based on an African foundation. And when you take it to the spirit level, then you have the level where everything is connected. And that was one of the things we did when we did the discipline shift is Lawford Goddard, who was Dr. Wade Noble's partner, he concluded that our discipline was not simply a discipline where we taught different courses in different disciplines, but it was multidimensional. And that meant that scholarship had to draw from many domains of knowledge. not just psychology or not just politics or not just history. It had to be holistic. And that is part of the spirit orientation. And so that enables us to teach physics, chemistry, biology, because we rested it on spirit. And they had to go along with it because we weren't duplicating what the science department does. And that's how they generally block you from teaching science courses if you're in a Bachelor of Arts, or anything other, a humanities degree. So that was key. And so that ties again to fundamental principle of African civilization, spirit. And that's the foundation of African American culture, spirit. The essence of you, spirit. When the voice tells you or the feeling tells you don't do something, don't do it. Okay, that's it. Hope you all got something out of this. Hotep. And thank you for all the people that are watching. And I want to thank the people who have made donations to the show. And I hope you keep doing that and encourage people to subscribe. Hit the subscribers button. Hotep.